You're listening to Three Things to Know with Stephanie Haney, with experts and insiders on what you need to know in Northeast Ohio.
Hi, everybody. Welcome back to the Three Things to Know podcast. I'm Stephanie Haney. As always, I am so happy to have you here with me today. Especially happy today because I get to share about our WKYC Studios podcast family growing. We have quite a few great podcasts. In case you didn't know, of course, there's this one, Three Things to Know. I also have my daily Monday through Friday podcast, 3 News Now with Stephanie Haney. That's a rundown of your top stories from WKYC.com. We've got a health podcast. It's called Health Yeah with Monica Robbins, our senior health correspondent. Love the pun in the name, by the way. We have a podcast for moms coming from our Go anchor, Maureen Kyle, and a brand new limited series podcast called Bomb City U.S.A. from our 3 News investigative reporter, Rachel Polansky. And that's who I'm talking to today. True crime is such a fascinating field. People love it. There's so much interesting psychology behind it, and sort of just hearing the stories of the wild things that happen is something that a lot of people want to know about. So if you're going to do true crime, I think a good approach to that is to be very niche about it. And what could be more niche than a true crime podcast focused on organized crime and the underworld of mobster life in Cleveland in the 1970s. And that's what this podcast is about, Bomb City U.S.A. with Rachel Polansky. It's fascinating. In her podcast, multiple episode limited series, we hear never before told stories from people who were in the mix, who are still alive today. Incredible, never before heard interviews from key players to bringing down mobster life in Cleveland at that time. And it's just fascinating. So I'm going to bring Rachel in. She's a friend of the show. You've heard her here before on the 3 Things to Know podcast. She'll tell us all about it. Let's bring her in right now. Rachel, thanks for coming back to the 3 Things to Know podcast today. Glad to have you back.
Thank you, Stephanie. I am so happy to be back. Thanks for having me.
And today we have you back in a much more expansive capacity. You know, you've been with us in the past, sharing some of those hidden gems in Northeast Ohio. But today we're talking about your podcast, Bomb City USA. Very exciting. I want to ask you, how did you decide to do a podcast on mobster life in Cleveland?
So it's super fascinating, the backstory of Cleveland's mobster history. So many people don't know about this. And, you know, I myself really didn't have that much knowledge of this up until maybe a year and a half ago. And I did this story where we were talking about this guy who's in prison. He is one of Danny Green's lieutenants. So Danny Green, for those familiar with mobster history in Cleveland, was an Irishman who was trying to take over mobster life from the well-entrenched Italian mafia here. So this right-hand man, his name is Kevin McTaggart. He's in prison. He's been in prison, since the 80s, and he's trying to get out of prison now. He's trying to get a compassionate release. And so this came across my desk, and I did a story on it maybe a year ago. And I'm like, this is so interesting. I want to know the backstory. And so I started just reading through, online books, the history of all of this. And I'm like, this is so fascinating. It would be such a cool podcast. And I pitched it to my producer, and he's like, yeah, it's really interesting, but a lot of it's been done. You know, they've made movies about it. They've done TV shows. And I'm like, but they haven't done a podcast. And he's like, all right, well, what's going to be different about it? And that's where I was like, okay, that's a good question. And so we started digging through and finding players from this time period. And what's different about our podcast is this is never before told stories from people you've never heard from. So we have this retired FBI agent, Bobderick, who has never talked with media before. And he is actually the agent who identified Danny Green's body after he was blown up. He also was the one that convinced various mobsters to flip and become government witnesses. So we have his stories. Yeah, I see you're familiar.
I am. Well, of course, I've been listening to your podcast, and I find this absolutely fascinating. I want to ask you more about that in a minute on how you actually nailed down those interviews, because I mean, that's some top-notch investigative reporting, absolutely, to get those conversations to happen. But first, I want to talk more about, so this came across your desk a year and a half ago. So how long has this podcast been in the works? All that time?
Yeah, so I've been working on this. It's kind of been my COVID passion project on the side. I've been doing it at least the last year. My husband can definitely attest to that because it's been a lot of weekends of writing and listening and reading, and it's kind of become my weekend project. And then most recently, in the last couple months, I started writing the actual episodes, and I went to our managers and, they knew I was working on it, but told them it was ready. And, we got an editor at the station to start helping putting these together. And then just, a couple weeks ago, we finally launched. But yeah, it's been at least a year of reading and researching and writing and finding people and talking to people. And it's been a big project, but it's been a lot of fun.
I think a lot of people don't realize necessarily how much work goes in to something like that. People don't just appear at the drop of a hat, and clearly it's very apparent from the podcast how much research you put in, how much backstory you knew, to then sort of have to boil it down to these 30-minute episodes where you're really putting the best of the best, the most important stuff in there. Let's talk about episode 1. You mentioned this. This kind of centers around the Irishman, Danny Green. I have to give you a compliment here on the editing here. I love the detail. For people who aren't familiar with the story of Danny Green's death, he was going to the dentist. There's a dentist drill that you hear in there. I couldn't love that more. So great. Was that the editor's touch? Is that something that you had in mind?
Yeah, so it's definitely a mix. And our editor is Gianni Catalano, and he's awesome. And yeah, that was a bit of both of us where, we went back and forth with, what we wanted to include and what we didn't. Because again, you want people to, it's different. We're so used to TV. I'm a TV reporter, so I'm so used to people seeing my stories. The podcast is a little different because it's not visual. So we want people to be taken there. So that was, one of the ways that we wanted to do that. But it was hard because you want some sounds so people feel like they're there, but you don't want it to be too gimmicky either. So it was tough to draw that line. But I think we did a good job. And same with the music, you want dramatic music, but you don't want it to be too over the top. So yeah, that was really a mixture of both of us, but he did a really great job. And that specific example, the dentist drill, that was all him.
Well, I think you did a very nice job between the two of you of finding that fine balance. I really did feel like I was there in the moment. And of course that scene was all about the bombshell to kind of an unintentional pun there. I do a lot of intentional puns. That was an unintentional one about the death of Danny Green. Now, it was a pretty big get for you to get that FBI agent, Bob Frederick, who's never talked to anyone. How did you make that happen?
So that took a long time. And again, I'm an investigative reporter, so I do a lot of source building. And that is one of those. So first I have to give credit to my producer, Phil Trexler. He's been in this business and he's lived in Cleveland for 30 years. So he has a lot of good connections. And one of his connections knew Bob. So that helped get my foot in the door. But once we met Bob, he was definitely skeptical of us and wasn't sure if he wanted to talk to us. And it took about 5 or 6 months of just, meeting him and talking with him before he ever let me hit that record button. He was definitely skeptical, and I definitely needed to prove myself and build that relationship. And I do what I do in all of my interviews when I'm trying to get people to talk to me, is that I try to approach them as people, as a human, and not as a reporter. So many people have a bad taste in their mouth for whatever reason, with strangers or with the media or whatever. So I try to just build those relationships on trust and, transparency. And that was one of those that really paid off. And I have to say, when I put out, we had some TV stories that went along with these too, and the TV stories came out first. And when I got that text from Bob that he liked it, I was like, oh, thank God. That's I just did not want to let him down, after he shared his story for the first time. And he also connected me with a lot of others for this project. So yeah, it was a process. It was a process for sure.
And for those of you, just a quick detail, if you're not familiar, he's the person who actually identified Danny Green's body the day that he was killed. So huge get right there. Now, I want you to talk to me about another character in episode 1, which is all about the Irishman. Talk to me about Rick Porrello.
Right. So Rick Pirello is an author and a historian here in Cleveland. He has written multiple books about Cleveland mafia life, including a book all about Danny Green, a book about Shonda Burns, who was another notorious Cleveland racketeer and Jewish mobster. And one of his book about the Irishman was then made into a movie, Kill the Irishman, which people are probably familiar with. So he is another great source. He also has an interesting tie to all this. He is the grandson of the Pirello mafia family from Cleveland that began in the 1920s. So if you go way back into that history, and I get into this in episode 1, there was the Pirellos and the Leonardos, and they kind of birthed the Cleveland mafia. And so his grandfather was Raymond Pirello. And so he has that. He also was a police chief for a time. So he's just a wealth of knowledge and a great interview, and really just knowledgeable on, the backstory. So he was great for helping us delve into the history part of it. Because I wanted the podcast to be, true crime, organized crime, history. It's kind of like a mix of all of those things. So he was really great for helping us there.
Okay, let's talk about another amazing get that you had in episode 1. You got someone who knew the Italian mobsters, an anonymous source. Tell me about that. How'd you track down that person? How'd you get that person to talk to you?
Right. So it's, and that's tough too, because this, even though 40 years have passed, this is still tough for people that were connected to all of this, whether it's family members of those who were killed or family members of former mobsters. It's still a touchy subject for people. So it took a lot of, again, relationship building to get these people to talk. And I think the one you're talking about there, again, as you earn trust from some people, then they kind of connect you to others. And as I kept kind of unraveling this web, I kept meeting more and more people. And as I went, that's kind of how I would talk to different people and hear their stories, and then ask them if we could record, if I could share their names, and, go one step at a time. And so there's a lot of people that I've talked to throughout all of this that are not even in the podcast, because they didn't want anything to be revealed. And then there's others that agreed, like this one, if they were able to be kept anonymous. So it was all just through also like the family tree, like, peeling back those layers and seeing who was still alive. That's another issue. A lot of people from this time period are dead or behind bars. Mm-hmm. So that was a challenge, like I was looking through different documentaries that were made, and there's people that I'm like, oh, that'd be a great person to talk to, but they're not here anymore. So that's another reason too why I really want to put this podcast out, because I don't know how much longer we'll be able to. Another one of our sources was a lawyer who was the attorney for the mobsters, and James Willis, and he I think he said he's 93 or 94 now, and he has these incredible stories. And again, just to show you that just the age of some of the people we're talking with, 80s, 90s, or sometimes it's family members of those the people that might have been a former mobster or that kind of thing. So it's a lot of just like peeling back layers, and then telling people what your goal is, what your mission is, what we're trying to do here, which is really at the end of the day just telling stories. Mm-hmm. There's no like bad guy.
Right. And it's a fascinating piece of Cleveland history for sure. And when you mention the challenge of people being alive, it's not just because of age, it's because people like Danny Green were blown up by the other mobsters in town, you know? So fascinating all around. Okay, let's transition to talking about episode 2 now, which the second episode that's out. This is where you talk about the men who flip, and this focuses on the man who killed Danny Green. What was it like to hear Ray Ferrito, the man who killed Danny Green? You're listening to this on tape. Talk about how he felt killing a man.
Oh my gosh. It's unbelievable. So when I found that video, I was stunned. So for those that haven't listened to it yet, it's from 1984. Ray Ferrito has just gotten out of prison. And they ask him, does he have any remorse for killing Danny Green? And he says, to me, it was like having a glass of wine. I felt nothing. And it's absolutely chilling to hear these words come out of his mouth. And when I saw that, I'm like, oh my gosh, we need to get this interview because he too is dead now. So I can't get that interview. So I found, it was like on a TV show, a crime TV show in like the 1980s. So I found the production company that did it, and they're no longer around anymore, but they were acquired by someone else who was acquired by someone else. And long story short, I finally found the owners of it. And so we were able to get that sound for the story. But what I thought was so interesting was I showed it to Bob Bobderick because he was the first one who interviewed Ray Ferrito. And he was not shocked at all because he was like, this is exactly how he was in the interrogation room, you know, just cold as ice. It is chilling. That sound, I just think, is so interesting. And again, I touch on it in the episode, but he's this ice cold killer, but he has this ambition. He wants to be a Cleveland mobster, and so they tell him if he kills Danny Green, he will be initiated into the family. But of course, things don't go that way. And it's a sloppy job, and they end up getting caught, and Bob convinces him to flip, and that's a whole nother story. But it is just really, really powerful stuff.
It really is. And the story of how he got caught, by the way, is incredible. I'm not going to give away the details here because you need to listen to the podcast. But when you hear how he got caught, it's shocking.
Yeah. It sounds like a movie. Like, it sounds like it can't be real. It's so crazy. It's unreal. But again, you hear, I love hearing Bob tell the story because it just makes it even better. Because I mean, I can, of course, spit out the details, but it's so much better to hear it from, the people who lived it.
And the person who got him to eventually flip, by the way, on other mobsters to kind of save his own skin a little bit.
Right.
Also, that's in episode 2. Very fascinating. Now, speaking of it being like a movie, there's actually a scene in a very famous mobster movie that's kind of tied to Cleveland. Tell me about that.
Right. And so we don't know for sure, but this was funny. So Bob was telling me when these mobsters were eventually convicted. So this is like the Godfather at the time was James Jack White Licavoli, and a couple of his lieutenants. So they were convicted, and before they go to federal prison, they're in Cuyahoga County Jail for a little bit. And while they're there, they were treated like kings, he tells me. And I'm like, what do you mean? And he said they would order special food from Cleveland, Little Italy, from Murray Hill, and had wine and food. And he's like, I wouldn't be surprised if they had women. Like, it was just like they were just running the joint. And for those, when he told me, I was like, wait a second, this sounds like the scene from Goodfellas. So for those who have seen Goodfellas, and I was like, did they steal that from Cleveland? And he's like, they might have. Like, I don't know. So I mean, it's definitely possible. I'm sure these movies got it from somewhere. And that did happen here. And when the FBI did find out what they were doing, they of course went to the warden and told him to cut that out and to crack down on that. And eventually these guys did go to federal prisons. But for a short time, they were getting Cleveland's Little Italy cuisine right at Cuyahoga County Jail.
Amazing. That's pretty shocking. That's shocking. I mean, it is, but it isn't, right? Different time, at least we
Very different time. Yeah, very different time.
All right, what do you think of what you've covered so far? Episodes 1 and 2 are out right now. What's the most shocking thing so far in those 2 episodes?
Yeah, I mean, I love all of it. I think a lot of stuff we've talked about, like the how these guys flip, how they go from being, just the process, to save their own skin a little bit. That I think is really fascinating. And then what I also get into it in episode 2 with Rudy Giuliani, I think is another twist. So fast forward a little bit from Ray Ferrito, and Angelo Leonardo gets arrested as well, and he was the Cleveland Godfather after Licavoli, and so he gets arrested, indicted on federal RICO murder charges. And again, my friend Bob goes to visit him in prison, and he gives him his business card, and he says, if you ever want to work with us, give me a call. And Angelo called him a week later, and Bob was shocked because he would become the first sitting mafia boss to ever become a government witness. So this is a huge deal, not just in Cleveland, but around the country. And so meanwhile, Rudy Giuliani is an up and coming young prosecutor in New York City who's going after the 5 New York City crime families. And so Angelo could be Rudy's star witness. So Bob brings all of this to Rudy, and that's kind of how this all came to be. And I know I'm like spitting out a lot of names, and that's again the challenge with all of this. There's a lot of players involved, but it's super interesting. So this Cleveland Godfather essentially was able to help bring down 5 New York City Godfathers through his testimony. And we also found that testimony, which is from like 1985. He testified before the Senate. Also super interesting. He was like hidden behind this curtain to shield his identity. But we found a couple actual audio recordings from that. And he just kind of talks about what he did and the initiation process to get into the crime family. And it's really, really incredible stuff. So we have some of that in there as well. And then we have Bob's story of, how he convinced him to flip, and then the process after that. So this guy, he went from, having like 100 years in prison reduced to like 2 years in prison. But he brought down crime families. So.
And then spent the rest of his life looking over his shoulder, I'm sure.
Probably. Another tidbit there, he did eventually come out of the witness protection program, and he came back to Cleveland, and he died peacefully in his sleep at the age of 95 in, I think, Parma. So it kind of also just touches on the fact that, the mafia world really isn't really existent here anymore. So he was able to die peacefully, which I thought was pretty interesting.
That is fascinating. I would never have expected that. I thought for sure he was going up just like Danny Green in a car bomb out of the dentist.
Right. If we were back in the 70s and 80s, probably. And we get into that in the podcast too. But the podcast is called Bomb City U.S.A. because we were the bomb capital. That 2-year period when Danny Green was blown up, there were 37 bombings here in Cuyahoga County, where Cleveland is located. So it is crazy. Yeah. If you're in the mafia, or if the mafia doesn't like you in the 70s, you're going to want to think twice when you turn on the ignition to your car, for sure.
Yeah, I think so. Well, fascinating stuff, Rachel. I love that you chose to dive into this. It's so interesting. There's more episodes to come. What else do we have coming out for Bomb City USA? What can we expect?
Yeah, I'm really excited. So episode 3, I just finished writing, actually, and my editor's working on it right now. It's pretty interesting. It's about these mobbed up burglars, and we're following the story. Again, people might not realize Cleveland, not only did we have this influential mobster life, we also had some of the best burglars in the world. And so I talk with this crew of mobbed up burglars. There's the Dinzio brothers. They're out of Youngstown. And then there's Phil Christopher, who's often called Super Thief. He's out of Cleveland. And both, again, Phil Christopher's in his 70s now. Emil Dinzio's in his 80s, and I tracked them both down. They both agreed to do interviews, and we had this crazy story of one of the biggest bank burglaries they pulled off, and to this day, it's in the top 10 biggest bank burglaries ever. They went to California, and they, again, depending on the number, people, it's funny how stories become larger than life over time. But Phil Christopher says they pulled off a $30 million bank burglary. Emil Dinzio says it was $12 million. The FBI ended up recovering somewhere between $2 and $4 million. So I guess we'll never really know just how much money was there. But they pulled off this bank burglary in this tiny little sleepy beach town in Laguna Niguel. It was at the United California Bank, and we dig into that whole process in episode 3, how they did it, the different fights that went on. And again, all these years later, when I told Emil Dinzio that I had interviewed Phil Christopher, he called him a rat. They are not friends. They still have bad blood to this day after, the fallout of that. They both spent 20 plus years in prison. And so they tell me about that. It's super fascinating. And I think these guys, they're at that point in their lives where like they want their stories out there. Why not? Yeah. So it's really cool. I feel like we're really like going behind the curtain and hearing these stories. You might have read about them, you might have heard about them, but you haven't heard it like this. I really, really tried to make this podcast different. And I tried to bring the storytelling that I bring in my TV stories to the podcast. It's not just, people talking back and forth. Like we've tried to really dig into the stories and how they did it. And I think that's really a really cool thing.
Yeah, wild to hear you mention the tie to Laguna Niguel. I know Laguna Niguel from my time in Los Angeles, and to think that any of this was going on there is just very interesting, very fascinating. It just really is just a small world. Rachel, This is incredible. When will episode 3 drop?
So episode 3 is going to drop next Thursday. And then we're going to have 4 episodes total. And then episode 4 will drop the following Thursday. And each episode is about half an hour long. And the last episode, we kind of are going to recap Kevin McTaggart, who I mentioned at the beginning, who brought this all up in the first place when I did that story. He's the mobster that's trying to get out of prison now. Kind of interesting tidbit. Just last week, we broke another story. Cleveland professional football player Bernie Kosar says if Kevin gets out of jail, that he will have him live with him. He said he can live with him on his farm and take care of the day-to-day operations. So
amazing,
weird tidbits and ties here in this story.
What more could you want? Mobster history, Cleveland Browns icon. That's a story tailor-made for Cleveland, Northeast Ohio.
Well, I remember when we broke that story last week, I told our digital director, Denise, I'm like, this headline, like, I don't even know. Like, this headline's unbelievable. Like, it doesn't even sound real. But, it's crazy. It really is.
It does sound like another movie. Well, I'm so glad that you're doing this project. Rachel, everybody listen to Bomb City U.S.A. It's on all podcast platforms. I'm hooked after the first 2 episodes. I can't wait to hear episode 3. I cannot wait to hear episode 4. Literally dying for it. Rachel, thank you so much for your time today. I appreciate it.
Of course. Thank you for having me on, and I really appreciate it, and I hope everybody enjoys Bomb City USA as much as I enjoyed making it.
I can't wait for the rest of those episodes to drop. That Bernie Kosar tie-in? What? Only in Cleveland was something like that. And I do hope that if that happens, that they make it into a movie, maybe a reality TV show here in Cleveland about the Bernie Kosar rehabilitation of this former mobster. Fascinating. By the way, that's on WKYC.com if you want to read the letter that Bernie wrote in support of the release of this person. Quite interesting. Now, as we're talking about all these mobster ties here in the greater Cleveland area, that brings us to what you need to know in NEO. And Rachel mentioned that author with ties to the Pirello family. Well, Joseph Pirello's former home is in Cleveland Heights, and you can go visit it. It's at 2862 Berkshire Road. It is a quaint little cottage, maybe kind of unassuming, not something that you would expect a big mob boss to live in, but it was once home to Joseph Big Joe Porrello, and he was a very big deal in the Cleveland crime scene. his roots in the mafia go all the way back to the early days of Prohibition. So we're talking down the family tree from Rick Pirello. And what he did was he helped smuggle corn sugar to bootleggers so that they could produce their alcohol. Now, he had a short but consequential run. He was reportedly the most influential corn sugar baron, what a title, in Cleveland from 1927 up until he was gunned down in 1930. And his home in Cleveland Heights is listed as one of 9 historical landmarks that you absolutely must visit in Cleveland on the site onlyinyourstate.com. So if you're in the Cleveland Heights area, you need to know that in NEO. And if you love the mobster world, listen to Rachel's podcast. Pop a podcast on, get in the car, drive to Cleveland Heights, and check out the former home of Joseph Big Joe Porrello. And now that brings me to a good follow for this week. If you're into the true crime scene, you need to be following James Renner, specifically on Instagram. Now, James Renner is an award-winning journalist. He's an author of True Crime Addict, and he's also got a podcast. His podcast is called The Philosophy of Crime, and that's what his Instagram handle is, Philosophy of Crime. Now, on the podcast, he looks to philosophy to answer big questions about unsolved mysteries. We're talking about questions like, are killers born? Or are they made? Does everyone have the capacity to commit murder? Why is true crime so popular today? I find that particular question very fascinating. What I love about his Instagram, though, is it's very tongue-in-cheek. It does not take itself too seriously. It's full of memes about the people who watch true crime and about the genre itself. And every time I see a post pop up in my feed, I can't help but laugh. It's one of those things where you scroll through it in the feed and you see it and you're like, huh. It's that kind of laugh. It's like the laugh where you're like, yeah, I never thought about it that way. But that is funny. And we are like that. And people are weird. And we're all into this true crime thing. And it's a little interesting and kind of makes you think, like, what's wrong? What's wrong with us that we're so into this true crime space? Anyway, James Renner, a good follow on Instagram. Philosophy of Crime is the Instagram handle. And then from there, you can find his podcast and his other things. If you like true crime, if you like not taking yourself too seriously, you will like following him on Instagram. And that's it for this week's 3 Things to Know podcast. Thanks for being here. If you enjoyed yourself, if you liked the show, I hope that you'll subscribe if you're not already and leave a rating and a review. That is actually really helpful. I know that can be annoying to be asked to do that, but it's super helpful, helps us connect with more people here in Northeast Ohio, because at the end of the day, we just want to be in your ears here on this podcast on 3 Things to Know. Okay, I'll see you all back next week. Between now and then, everybody stay safe, be well. I'm Stephanie Haney.
Thanks for listening to 3 Things to Know with Stephanie Haney from WKYC Studios. Subscribe now to stay in the know.